The bell rang at 9:31 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and Nadia Osei watched it on her phone from a coffee shop in Hayes Valley, 40 minutes south of the New York Stock Exchange, by flight and approximately 4 years away by every other metric that mattered. The live stream was on CNBC. The chyron read, Vantage, AI begins trading, NYSEVTGIPO, price, $28. The camera panned to the exchange floor, and there was Marcus Hale in a cobalt blue tie she'd never seen before, grinning the grin she'd spent 4 years watching him calibrate for rooms. The one that said, I built something, and I'm not surprised it worked. And he reached forward and pressed the ceremonial button, and the bell went and the ticker went live and the crowd around him erupted. Nadia put her phone face down on the table. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She thought 43 minutes. She gave herself 43 minutes in this coffee shop, and then she had a 10:15 with a venture capitalist named Priya Anand in a building 6 blocks away. And she needed to be sharp. And she needed to be present. And she needed to remember that everything she had spent the last 8 months building was about to matter more than anything Marcus Hale did on a trading floor in Lower Manhattan. She picked her phone back up. VTG was trading at $31.40. She turned the phone over again. 43 minutes. She had earned the right to feel this for 43 minutes. 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days earlier, Nadia Osei had been sitting in a different coffee shop, a worse one in a different city, in a different version of her life, when Marcus Hale slid into the chair across from her and said, I have an idea that's either the next Google or the most expensive mistake of my career, and I need someone who can tell me which. She had been 29. She had just left a senior engineering role at a company whose name she still couldn't say publicly because of the NDA, and she had 3 months of runway and an obsession with a specific problem in enterprise AI that she'd been turning over in her mind for 2 years without quite finding the right architecture to solve it. Marcus was 31. He had an MBA from Wharton, a talent for narrative, the ability to enter a room and make every person in it believe they were about to be part of something, and exactly one technical insight that was genuinely good. He'd read a paper she'd published in a machine learning journal the previous year and understood it well enough to know he needed someone who understood it better than he did. They talked for 3 hours that first day. He described his vision, an AI system that could manage enterprise procurement workflows at scale, reducing decision latency from weeks to hours. She described why his proposed architecture wouldn't work and what would. He listened with the quality of attention she would come to understand was his best asset. Genuine total, the kind of listening that made you feel that you were the most important thing in the room. Can you build it? He asked. Already thinking about it, she said. They shook hands on a co-founder agreement over a yellow legal pad. Equal equity, joint decision-making. Her engineering, his business development. Vantage AI would be a partnership. She signed a term sheet 3 weeks later without a lawyer because she was 29 and believed in the handshake and believed in Marcus and believed above all in the problem she was about to spend 4 years solving. She would not make that mistake again. The thing she had built over those 4 years was not what the CNBC cameras were showing. The cameras were showing Marcus, his tie, his grin, his fluency with the vocabulary of disruption and scale. They were showing the slides from his roadshow, the growth curves, the enterprise client logos, the market size projections. They were showing the narrative of Vantage AI as a company founded by a visionary leader who had identified a gap in the enterprise software market and assembled a world-class team to fill it. What Nadia had built was the system itself. She had written the core algorithmic architecture, the procurement intelligence engine that actually worked, that could ingest the chaotic and consistent data of a large enterprise's purchasing history and find patterns that reduced costs by an average of 23% in the first year of deployment. She had built the data pipeline. She had designed the API layer. She had made the critical decision in month 7 to shift from a rule-based to a reinforcement learning approach, a decision that Marcus had initially resisted and that had turned out to be the difference between a product that worked and a product that worked at scale. She had hired 11 of the 14 engineers on the technical team. She had run the technical interviews, set the culture, established the code review standards, and maintained the architecture through 3 pivots and 2 near-death experiences in the early funding rounds. She had done all of this as co-founder and CTO, and her name was on the company's About page and in the SEC filing and on the original term sheet on the yellow legal pad. She was not invisible. She was simply, and this was the distinction she had spent 8 months understanding, not the story. Marcus was the story. He had always been the story. He was very good at being the story. And being the story she had come to understand was indistinguishable from owning the story in the specific grammar of startup culture until suddenly it wasn't. The cap table document had arrived in her inbox on a Tuesday evening in February, 11 months before the IPO, 8 months before she left, forwarded accidentally by Marcus's assistant, who had intended to send it to the company's outside counsel. The subject line was VTG Cap Table Revision V7. Confidential, do not distribute. She had opened it. The document was 43 pages of equity modeling projections for the pre-IPO share structure under various funding scenarios. Her name was in it. Her equity was in it. And in scenario D, which was labeled in the tab at the bottom of the spreadsheet, preferred structure. Her voting shares had been converted to non-voting common, in a mechanism she didn't recognize triggered by a clause she had never agreed to, and that appeared to reference an amendment to the original co-founder agreement that she had never signed. She sat at her kitchen table in her apartment in Soma and read the document 3 times. Then she called her friend and former colleague Tae-young Park, who had left a corporate law firm 18 months earlier to do startup work, and said, "I need you to look at something, tonight." Tae-yang arrived at 10 p.m. with takeout containers and his laptop. He read the document. He asked her several questions. He read it again. "Okay," he said finally. He set his chopsticks down. "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be very precise. The amendment, it references Clause 7.4c of the co-founder agreement. Did you ever sign an amendment to the original agreement?" "No." "You're certain?" "I have every document I've ever signed in this company in a folder. Show me the clause." He showed her. She went to her folder. There was no such amendment. "Then what you're looking at," Tae-yang said carefully, "is a proposed equity restructuring that, if executed, would reduce your voting power below the threshold required to block major corporate decisions, including, and this is the part I want you to pay attention to, the appointment of new board members, amendments to the co-founder agreement, and the structure of any future liquidity event." "The IPO," she said. "The IPO," he confirmed. "If this restructuring goes through, Marcus controls the outcome of the IPO essentially unilaterally. You would have economic participation, your shares still exist, but you'd have no governance rights." She was very still. "How long has this been in progress?" she asked. Tae-young scrolled back to the document metadata. "Version 7, he said. "First created?" He looked up. 14 months ago. 14 months ago. She had been in the office 14 months ago, writing the reinforcement learning architecture. She had been running technical interviews and debugging the API and managing a team of 14 people. She had been doing all of that while Marcus, in a parallel track she had known nothing about, had been working with lawyers and bankers on version 1 of a document designed to remove her ability to govern the company she'd built. "He's been planning this for over a year," she said. "It looks that way." She sat with that. Then she said, "What do I do?" Tae-young looked at her steadily. "That depends on what you want." "I want what I built," she said. "I want the company." "You can't have the company. The institutional investors are already committed to Marcus. They see him as the face of the business, and they won't support a leadership change this close to IPO. He paused. "But you can refuse to sign the amendment. You can fight the restructuring legally. It's a breach of the original co-founder agreement, and you have a strong case. And you can—" He stopped. "What?" "You can leave," he said, "and take everything you're legally entitled to take with you." She did not do anything for 3 weeks. This was not inaction. It was the most disciplined thing she had ever done. She went to the office every day. She ran her stand-up meetings and her code reviews and her architecture sessions. She attended the executive team meetings where Marcus presented IPO readiness updates, and she asked her normal questions and gave her normal input. She sat across from him at the leadership table twice a week for 3 weeks and gave no indication that she had seen a document she wasn't supposed to see or that anything in her understanding of their partnership had shifted. She was performing. She was performing with the cold, specific discipline of a person who understood that what came next required time to prepare. In those 3 weeks, she retained Taeyong formally. She copied every piece of technical documentation she had created. Every design document, every architecture decision log, every patent application she had contributed to onto a personal encrypted drive. She reviewed the original co-founder agreement with 3 different attorneys to establish the precise contours of her rights. She built a spreadsheet of the 11 engineers she had personally hired, mapped their current situations. Equity vesting schedules, satisfaction levels, compensation relative to market, and began to understand which of them might, under the right circumstances, be willing to have a conversation. She did not make any of those calls yet. She just built the map. And then on a Thursday evening in the 4th week, she sat at her kitchen table with Taeyong's legal memo and her own spreadsheet and the original yellow legal pad term sheet in a frame on her wall. She had framed it 3 years ago as a gesture toward the founding mythology of the company, and she made a decision. She was not going to fight for Vantage AI. She was going to build something better. The meeting with Priya Anand at 10:15 was in a building on Sansom Street that housed 4 different venture firms, which meant the lobby smelled like a very specific mixture of cold brew and ambition that Nadia had learned to find simultaneously amusing and useful. Priya was 40 Indian American with a reputation in the Valley for the specific kind of intelligence that cut through the performance layer of a pitch and went directly to the mechanism underneath. She had backed 3 AI companies that had produced significant returns and had passed on 2 that had produced larger ones, which she discussed openly and without apparent defensiveness, which Nadia found encouraging. They had been introduced through a mutual contact 8 weeks earlier. They had had 2 preliminary calls. This was the 3rd meeting, which meant it was the one where something happened or didn't. Nadia arrived 4 minutes early. She was wearing a navy blazer over a white shirt and dark trousers, the outfit she wore when she needed to be taken seriously in a room where she was already planning to be the smartest technical person present. She carried a single folder. No deck. She had told Priya's assistant there would be no deck, and Priya had responded through the assistant good. Priya was already in the conference room. She stood when Nadia came in and shook her hand with the directness of someone who had long since stopped performing the social rituals of the industry that weren't useful. Vantage went public this morning, Priya said. It was not quite a question. I watched the bell, Nadia said. From here, roughly. How did it feel? Nadia sat down. She thought about the honest answer. Like confirmation, she said. That the timing is right, that the market understands what this technology can do, and that I know how to do it better than what's trading on that exchange right now. Priya looked at her for a moment. Tell me about the architecture. Nadia opened her folder. She talked for 40 minutes. She described the core insight that had made Vantage work the reinforcement learning approach she had designed, and then she described precisely and technically why that approach had fundamental limitations that the version currently powering Vantage's product had never fully resolved, and how she had spent the past 8 months designing the next generation architecture that addressed those limitations. She described what the new system could do that Vantage's couldn't. She described the market it opened, not just enterprise procurement, but the broader category of autonomous enterprise operations, a market that analysts were currently sizing at $340 billion. She described the 11 engineers she had spoken to. 7 of them had committed to joining. 3 more were in final conversations. 1 had declined, which she mentioned without editorializing. She described what she needed: a Series A round, 18 months of runway, the infrastructure to build fast. When she finished, Priya was quiet for a moment. The non-compete, she said. Marcus will invoke it. I've had 3 attorneys review it, Nadia said. The agreement was signed in California. California does not enforce non-competes. Full stop. He'll still file. He'll file and lose, and the filing will be public, And the public filing will raise questions about why the co-founder of Vantage AI left 8 months before the IPO, which will generate the kind of press that institutional investors don't enjoy. She paused. Marcus doesn't want that story in the market right now. His lockup period is 6 months. He needs the stock to hold. Priya studied her. You've thought about this carefully. I've thought about almost nothing else for 8 months. A silence. Outside the conference room window, San Francisco did its usual impersonation of a city that had already figured out the future. I have one more question, Priya said. Go ahead. Why didn't you fight for Vantage? You had grounds. The equity restructuring the unsigned amendment, your attorneys said you had a strong case. Nadia looked at her directly. Because fighting for Vantage would have taken 2 years and cost everything I had and produced at best a company where I won a legal battle and lost the engineering team and the culture and the 4 years of momentum we'd built. She paused. I didn't want to win a legal argument. I wanted to build a company. So I left and started building one. Priya picked up her pen. She wrote something on the notepad in front of her. What are you calling it? She said. Meridian Systems, Nadia said. Priya wrote that down too. When can you have a term sheet back to me? Nadia asked. Priya looked up. The corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile, something more precise. The expression of a person who has found the thing they were looking for. 2 weeks, she said. Nadia closed her folder. Outside the market was open and VTG was trading and the bell had rung and Marcus Hale was somewhere in lower Manhattan with his cobalt tie and his practiced grin and his narrative of a company he had built. Nadia picked up her bag. She had a company to build. The term sheet arrived in 13 days, not 14. Priya Anand was not a woman who let a stated timeline slip by even a day when she'd decided she wanted something. $8 million Series A, 18% dilution, a board seat for the firm, one for Nadia, one independent, standard protective provisions, a valuation that put Meridian Systems at $44 million pre-money, which was either very good or very conservative, depending on whether the next 18 months went the way Nadia had designed them to go. She read the term sheet at her kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, with Coffee and Tae Yang on the phone walking through each clause the way they'd been through every document in the past 8 months, carefully, completely with the specific attention of people who had learned the cost of not reading carefully enough. It's clean, Tae Yang said. Priya's firm doesn't play games with term sheets. What you see is what you get. The board composition is standard and actually favorable. You retain majority control through the Series A. You'd only lose that in a Series B if you raise above a certain threshold, and that's negotiable at the time. The IP assignment clause. Standard. Everything you build at Meridian is Meridian's. Everything you built before at Vantage, that's a different question, but we've been through that. Your contributions to Vantage are Vantages. What you're building now is architecturally distinct. I'm confident of that, and so is the patent attorney. She had spent 4 months making certain of that. The new architecture was not a copy of what she'd built at Vantage. It was the next thing, the thing she'd known was possible, while she was building the old thing and hadn't had the freedom to pursue. The distinction was real, not cosmetic. She had been very careful. Sign it, Tae Yang said. I know, but, she said. She signed it that afternoon. She signed it with her full name on every page in the conference room of Priya's firm, with 2 attorneys present and a notary, and the specific deliberate ceremony of a person who had learned what it meant to have your name on things. Meridian Systems was incorporated on a Friday in November, 6 weeks after the Vantage IPO. The first team meeting happened the following Monday morning in a rented conference room in a co-working space in Soma that smelled like carpet cleaner and optimism. 8 people sat around the table, Nadia and the 7 engineers who had committed first, including her VP of engineering, a woman named Claudia Ferreira, who had been the first person Nadia had called and who had said yes in under 4 hours. They were all people she had hired personally at Vantage. They had all she knew been watching what happened to her equity situation with the specific attentiveness of employees who understood that what happened to the founder happened eventually to them. I want to be clear about what we're building, Nadia said. She had not prepared remarks, she had prepared a whiteboard. She drew 3 boxes and connected them with arrows. This is the problem. This is why the current solution doesn't fully solve it. This is what we're going to build instead. She talked for 45 minutes. When she finished, Claudia said, "When do we start?" "We started 20 minutes ago," Nadia said. "The whiteboard was the beginning." Claudia smiled. 3 other engineers were already opening their laptops. That was Monday. By Thursday, they had a repository and a development environment and the first 800 lines of code for the core inference engine. By the end of the first month, they had a proof of concept that Nadia showed Priya on a video call, and Priya was quiet for a long moment and then said, "How soon can you get this in front of a potential customer?" "Define soon," Nadia said. 6 weeks. 8, Nadia said. "And I want the right customer, not the first customer." "Who's the right customer?" Nadia named a company, a Fortune 50 manufacturer with a procurement operation of sufficient complexity that it would stress test every part of the system, the kind of customer whose logo on a reference list would make every subsequent conversation shorter. "I know their CPO, Priya said. "I know," Nadia said. "That's why I named them." Shen. Marcus filed the lawsuit in December. She had expected it. Taeyang had told her to expect it, had prepared for it, had a response ready, but the actual arrival of the filing in her email at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday still produced a specific physical reaction she hadn't entirely anticipated. Not fear, something colder and more focused. The recognition that the thing she had known was coming had arrived, and that she was precisely as ready as she had made herself. The complaint alleged misappropriation of trade secrets, breach of fiduciary duty, breach of the co-founder agreement, and tortious interference with Vantage's business relationships. It was 68 pages long and had been prepared, she could tell from the language and structure, by a firm that specialized in exactly this kind of litigation and was very good at it. Marcus had resources. He had invested those resources here. Taeyang called at 7:15. "You've seen it. Reading now. Take your time. Then call me." A pause. "Nadia, this is what we prepared for. The California non-compete issue is decisive. The trade secret claims are going to require them to specify exactly what secret they claim you took, which is going to be very difficult given that your architecture is demonstrably distinct. This is serious, and it's also manageable." "I know," she said. "How are you?" She thought about the question honestly. Outside her window, San Francisco was doing its morning thing, the fog burning off over the bay, the light coming in at the angle that made the city look briefly like it was worth all the trouble it took to live in it. "Ready," she said. "Good." Another pause. "One more thing. The filing is public." "I know." "Which means the press will have it by noon." She had thought about this. She had thought about it for months. The specific question of how to manage the moment when the lawsuit became public, when the story of what had happened at Vantage was suddenly in the press, when she was no longer the woman who had quietly left 8 months before the IPO, but the woman who had been sued by her former co-founder. She had an answer. It was not the answer anyone expected. "Let it run," she said. "You don't want to get ahead of it." "I want to let it run for exactly 1 news cycle," she said. "Then I want to be available for comment. Not defensive comment, factual comment. The timeline, the cap table document, the amendment that was never signed. I want every reporter who covers this to understand that the lawsuit is a response to a prior action, not the initiating event." Taeyang was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant disclosure. The cap table document is mine as much as it's his. I was a party to those negotiations. I was supposed to be anyway." She paused. "He filed publicly." "Fine. Then the public gets the context." A long pause. "All right," Taeyang said. "Let's build the response." By noon, 3 tech press outlets had covered the filing. By 3 p.m., there were 12 articles. The headlines ranged from the predictably neutral Vantage AI sues, former co-founder over trade secret claims, to the more pointed, did Vantage's IPO come at its co-founder's expense, to the one that Nadia read 3 times, because it was the most accurate thing anyone had written about her situation in 8 months. The engineer who built Vantage AI is building something new. Her former partner is trying to stop her. By 5 p.m., VTG had dropped 4.2% from its morning high. By 7 p.m., her phone had 43 new messages. Journalists, potential customers who had seen the press, 3 investors who had passed on the Series A and were now apparently reconsidering, and one message from an engineer at Vantage she hadn't spoken to in 8 months, who said simply, "I've been following what's happening. Is there room on your team?" She added his name to a list she'd been keeping. She made dinner. She ate at her kitchen table with Tae Yang's response document on one side and the latest VTG stock chart on the other. And she thought about Marcus in his cobalt tie ringing the bell. And she thought about 14 months of cap table versions. And she thought about a yellow legal pad term sheet in a frame on her wall. And she thought about the whiteboard on the first Monday of Meridian's existence, the 3 boxes connected by arrows, the beginning of the thing she was actually building. VTG had opened at $31.40 this morning. It closed at $29.87. She washed her dishes. She went to bed. She set her alarm for 5:30 because they had a code review at 7, and she always read the latest commits before a code review because she was the person who had to know the system better than anyone else in the room. That had always been true. That would always be true. The difference now was that the room was hers. The first customer meeting happened 8 weeks after incorporation. Not 8. Claudia had pushed the team hard, and they'd shaved 2 weeks off the timeline, which was the kind of thing that happened when you had a team of people who were building something they believed in rather than something they'd been assigned to. The meeting was at the company's headquarters in Detroit, a vast campus that Nadia had researched for weeks, mapping the specific contours of a procurement operation that processed $12 billion in annual spend across 340 supplier relationships. She had read their last 3 annual reports and 2 industry analyst reports on their cost structure, and she had built a custom demonstration that was not a demo in the promotional sense, but a working system processing a subset of their actual publicly available data. The CPO was a woman named Janet Wu, 53 years old, 2 decades in operations, with the specific patience of someone who had seen many technology companies promise to solve her problems and had learned to evaluate carefully before believing any of them. Priya had made the introduction. Nadia had done everything else. They had 90 minutes. Nadia used 40 of them to let the system run live on Janet Wu's actual data, with Claudia managing the technical side from a laptop at the back of the room and 3 of the CPO's own analysts watching the outputs and quietly, then less quietly, discussing what they were seeing. At the 40-minute mark, one of the analysts said, "This is identifying a supplier consolidation opportunity we've been trying to model manually for 6 months." Janet Wu looked at the screen, then at Nadia. "Walk me through the methodology," she said. Nadia walked her through it. Precisely technically, without marketing language, the way she explained things to engineers with the assumption that the person across the table was intelligent and wanted the real answer. Janet Wu asked 7 questions. They were good questions. Nadia answered each one directly. At the end, Janet Wu leaned back in her chair. "I've seen 4 AI procurement systems in the last 18 months, she said. 3 of them were demonstrations. One of them was a product. This is a product." "Yes," Nadia said. "What's your pilot timeline?" 90 days to full deployment on your direct materials category. Results visible in 30. "And pricing?" Nadia named a number. Janet Wu didn't flinch. "We'll need to run this through our vendor evaluation process. Standard procedure, it'll take 6 weeks. "Understood," Nadia said. "We'll prepare whatever documentation you need." They shook hands. In the car to the airport, a shared ride with Claudia, who had been professionally quiet through the entire meeting and was now apparently finished with that, Claudia said, "She's going to sign." "Probably," Nadia said. "Definitely. Did you see the analyst in the blue jacket? He was texting someone from his own team during the demo. He wasn't being rude, he was excited." Nadia had seen it. She had clocked it at the 20-minute mark and adjusted her pacing accordingly, slowing the demonstration slightly, giving the analysts more time to process what they were seeing. Understanding that the internal conversation happening in real time was more valuable than anything she could say. She had been reading rooms since she was 22. It was one of the things Marcus had never quite understood about her. He thought reading rooms was his particular skill, the narrative intelligence, the interpersonal fluency. He had never noticed that she did it too differently from the technical side, through the specific attention to how people responded to a system performing in front of them. She looked out the car window at the Detroit skyline receding behind them. She had 11 engineers, $8 million, one almost certain first customer, and a system that was better than anything Vantage had ever shipped. She had, for the first time in 4 years, exactly the company she wanted to be building. The flight home was 2 hours. She spent the first hour reviewing Claudia's notes from the meeting, and the second hour sketching the architecture for the next major feature, the one that would make the pilot a renewal, and the renewal a contract. And the contract the first entry in a reference list that would make every subsequent sales conversation shorter. She landed in San Francisco at 9 p.m. She went home. She set her alarm for 5:30. She had work to do. The lawsuit went to a preliminary hearing in January, 6 weeks after filing, 4 weeks after the press coverage had done what Nadia had calculated it would do, which was complicate Marcus's narrative without quite destroying it. The hearing was in San Francisco Federal Court, a building that smelled like old marble and institutional carpet, and the specific formality of a place where consequential things happen in language most people couldn't parse. Nadia sat beside Tae-Yang at the plaintiff's defendants. She always got that backwards table and watched Marcus's lead attorney, a man named Franklin Greer, who had 20 years of IP litigation and a reputation for methodical patient destruction, lay out the case in the flat, precise language of someone who had made the same argument many times before and knew exactly where it landed. Marcus was at the other table. He wore a dark suit, no tie. He had the contained quality of someone performing calm, and Nadia, who had sat across from him in meetings for 4 years, could see the performance in the set of his shoulders. She had not looked at him directly. She had looked at Franklin Greer, at the judge, a woman in her 60s named Honorable Patricia Chen, who had a reputation for technical fluency and a low tolerance for posturing, and at the specific pages of the complaint that Tae-Yang had flagged for her attention. The hearing took 90 minutes. Judge Chen asked questions. Franklin Greer answered them smoothly. Tae-Yang answered 3 with the directness she'd come to trust in him over 8 months. No performance, just the precise legal argument stated once and clearly. At the end, Judge Chen set a discovery schedule and said in the measured way of someone who had already formed a view they were not yet required to share counsel. I want to be clear that this court will require the plaintiff to specify with particularity the precise trade secrets alleged to have been misappropriated. A general description of AI architecture and methodology will not be sufficient. We will need names, files, documentation. Understood. Franklin Greer said, "Understood, Your Honor, Your Honor." In the hallway afterward, Tae-Yang said, "That's good for us." "She's going to make them prove exactly what I took," Nadia said. "And they can't," he said, "because what you took is in your head and what you built with it is architecturally distinct from what's at Vantage. The moment they have to get specific, the case starts falling apart." She nodded. She had known this. She had built the new architecture with this in mind, not defensively, not primarily as legal protection, but as the natural evolution of her thinking, the thing she'd been working toward for years. The fact that it was also legally defensible was not a coincidence. It was the consequence of doing the work honestly. She went back to the office. The pilot contract with Janet Wu's company, the Fortune 50 manufacturer, which she still didn't name publicly because they'd requested confidentiality pending the vendor evaluation, signed in February. 90-day pilot, full direct materials category with a performance clause. If Meridian's system identified and facilitated cost savings of less than 15% in the first 60 days, the contract could be terminated without penalty. Claudia called her when the signed contract came through. "We need to celebrate." "After 60 days, Nadia said. "You're impossible." "I'm realistic, 60 days. Claudia laughed. "Fine, but I'm buying the good champagne and I'm putting it in the fridge right now." The pilot went live on a Tuesday morning in late February. Nadia watched the first real-world run of the system from her laptop in the office at 6 a.m. The same time zone difference meant the Detroit team was already 2 hours into their day, and she watched the system ingest the first week of live procurement data and begin the pattern recognition that was, she had always known the thing, it did better than anything else on the market. By the end of the first week, the system had flagged 14 supplier consolidation opportunities and 2 contract anomalies that the company's own procurement analysts had not caught. Nadia sent Janet Wu a weekly summary, clean technical numbers only, and Janet Wu replied with 3 words. This is working. By day 30, the savings figure was 19.3%. Claudia opened the champagne. Marcus's attorneys provided their trade secret specification in March, as required by Judge Chen's discovery order. It was a 112-page document that Nadia and Taeyang and 2 technical expert witnesses read over 4 days in Taeyang's conference room with takeout containers and yellow highlighters. The document claimed that Nadia had misappropriated the reinforcement learning methodology underlying Vantage's procurement intelligence engine, the specific data pipeline architecture, the API design structure, and 13 specific algorithmic techniques identified in Vantage's patent applications. The expert witnesses, both MIT-affiliated researchers with backgrounds in enterprise AI, reviewed Meridian's architecture against each claimed element. They produced a comparative analysis that was, Taeyang said, when he finished reading it, the clearest technical demolition I have ever seen in a trade secret case. Nadia read their analysis on a Saturday morning. It documented in precise technical language how each claimed element in Vantage's specification was either a standard industry technique, not protectable as a trade secret, an approach Nadia had developed prior to founding Vantage, demonstrably hers from the pre-Vantage paper she'd published, or an element that Meridian's architecture had departed from, so fundamentally that the claim of misappropriation was architecturally incoherent. On the last page, one of the experts, Dr. Keanu Makoa, whose reputation in the field Nadia had been aware of for 5 years, had added a note that was unusual for a technical expert report. In my assessment, the architecture described in Meridian's documentation represents a meaningful advance over the approach used at Vantage AI. The suggestion that the more sophisticated system was derived from the less sophisticated one reverses the direction of technical progress. She read that sentence twice. Then she sent it to Claudia with no message, just the screenshot. Claudia replied in 40 seconds, "The man gets it." In March, 2 things happened within the same week that Nadia would later think of as the week the balance shifted. The first was a piece in Wired, a long-reported feature that had been in progress for 2 months based on interviews with Nadia, 4 hours over 2 sessions, Taeyang, Priya, Claudia, and 3 engineers who had left Vantage for Meridian. The piece was titled, "Who Actually Built Vantage AI?" The engineer behind the technology takes her code and starts over. The writer had done her homework. She had read the original academic paper. She had spoken to technical sources who could assess the architecture. She had reviewed the public court filings with the help of a legal analyst. The piece was not a takedown of Marcus. It was careful and reported and technically precise. And it made 2 arguments that it documented thoroughly: that Nadia Osei's technical contributions to Vantage had been foundational rather than supplementary, and that her departure had been precipitated by an equity restructuring designed without her knowledge or consent. Marcus's PR team issued a statement. It was 3 paragraphs of careful language that disputed the characterization without making any specific factual claims. The statement of a team that understood it could not actually contradict what the piece had documented. VTG dropped 6.1% on the day the piece published. The second thing that happened that week was a call from an investor. Nadia didn't know a woman named Sasha Dreyfus, who ran a growth equity fund based in New York with $2 billion under management and a focus on B2B software. "I've been following what you're building," Dreyfus said. "The pilot customer results, the Wired piece. I want to have a conversation about your Series B." "We just closed a Series A 4 months ago," Nadia said. "I know. I'm thinking ahead." A pause. "The litigation will resolve. The technology is real. You have a reference customer producing results. These things don't stay quiet." Another pause. "I'd rather have the conversation now before you have 10 other people calling you than after." Nadia looked at her calendar. "I can do 2 weeks from Thursday." "I'll be in San Francisco that week," Dreyfus said. "Breakfast." "Lunch," Nadia said. "I work mornings." The case settled in April. Not because Nadia wanted to settle, she had told Taeyong explicitly that she was prepared to go to trial if necessary, but because the discovery process had produced something that Marcus had apparently not anticipated: the metadata from the cap table documents. Taeyong had requested through formal discovery all documents related to the equity restructuring discussions, including version histories and communication logs. Franklin Greer had attempted to limit the scope of this request and been denied by Judge Chen, who was not as Nadia had assessed, from the first hearing, a judge who had patience for incomplete disclosure. The documents that came through in discovery were even Taeyang, who was not given to dramatic assessments, had called them significant, a paper trail of 14 months of restructuring planning involving Marcus, the company's general counsel, 2 board members, and the lead banker from the IPO underwriting. The communication showed clearly and contemporaneously that the restructuring had been designed specifically to reduce Nadia's governance rights before the IPO, and that this design had been in progress for 14 months before she had found the cap table document. The communications also showed that 2 board members had been aware of the plan and had not disclosed it to Nadia despite being on a board on which she also served. "This is not just a co-founder dispute anymore," Taeyong told her when he'd finished reviewing the documents. "This is a breach of fiduciary duty by board members. That's a different and significantly more serious legal exposure." "For them," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Marcus is going to want to settle." "What do we want?" Taeyong was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" She thought about it carefully. She thought about what she had wanted 8 months ago when she sat at her kitchen table with the cap table document and Taeyong's takeout containers, and the specific cold clarity of understanding what had been done. She had wanted the company. She had decided she couldn't have the company and built something better. She had the something better now. It was running in Detroit, producing a 19.3% cost improvement, and she had a growth equity investor calling her about a Series B. What she wanted now was different from what she had wanted then. "I want the record to be accurate," she said. "I want formal acknowledgement in writing and a settlement agreement of my contributions to Vantage's technical foundation. I want the equity restructuring attempt documented in the settlement as the initiating event. And I want the non-compete withdrawn permanently." "That's achievable," Taeyong said. "What about money?" "Whatever is appropriate given the breach." She paused. "But the acknowledgement is not negotiable. The record matters." Taeyong drafted the settlement framework that afternoon. Franklin Greer receiving it took 3 days to come back. 3 days during which VTG dropped a further 3.8%, largely on press coverage of the discovery documents, and then came back with proposed language that was nearly what Nadia had asked for, with minor modifications to the specific phrasing of the technical contribution acknowledgement. She read the proposed language twice. It was close. It was not quite right. She redrafted it herself in 1 hour with the specific precision of someone who had spent 4 years writing documentation that needed to be exactly right. She sent her version back. Greer's team accepted it without further negotiation. The settlement was signed on a Thursday afternoon in April in Taeyang's conference room with the notary present and a bottle of sparkling water on the table that no one touched. Among other provisions, the signed agreement contained the following paragraph. Vantage AI acknowledges that Nadia Osei served as the company's co-founder and chief technology officer from inception through her departure in March of the prior year, and that her technical contributions, including the design of the core reinforcement learning architecture, the data pipeline infrastructure, and the API framework underlying Vantage's primary commercial product, were foundational to the development of the company's technology platform. She read it one more time in the conference room. Then she signed her name beneath it. The record was accurate now. She could move forward. Quotes. The settlement terms included a financial component, a number that Taeyong described as appropriate, and that Nadia agreed was appropriate, and that she did not disclose publicly because the agreement was confidential on that point, and because the number, while significant, was not the thing she had gone through all of this for. What she had gone through all of this for was in a paragraph. 8 sentences. Her name, her contributions, the record corrected. She called her mother that evening. Her mother, who was a civil engineer in Accra and who had raised Nadia and her 2 brothers in a household where the baseline assumption was that you did the most rigorous work possible and that the quality of the work was self-evidencing, and she read the paragraph over the phone. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said in Twi, "Good. Now finish what you started." "Yes, Mama," Nadia said. She went to bed at 10, which was early for her. She slept 8 hours, which was also unusual. When she woke at 5:30 and made coffee in the morning quiet of her Soma apartment, the settlement was still real and the paragraph was still in the document, and Meridian was still in Detroit producing results, and Sasha Dreyfus still wanted to talk about a Series B. Everything was still exactly where it was. She went to her desk. The pilot in Detroit converted to a full contract in May, a 3-year agreement covering direct and indirect materials procurement, which Claudia called when the signed copy came through and said, "Now can we celebrate?" "Yes," Nadia said. "Now we can celebrate." The champagne that had been in the refrigerator since February was, it turned out, still good. They drank it in the office, all 11 of them, plus the 3 engineers who had joined in the intervening months, making 14 total. And Nadia gave a short talk that she had not prepared, and that came out of her honest and complete the way things did when you finally had the time and space to say what you actually meant. "I want to tell you what I think this company is," she said. They were standing in the open workspace, everyone holding a glass of something champagne, sparkling water, the kombucha that their engineer Jiho insisted on bringing in cases. "Not what I pitched to investors, what I actually think." She paused. "I think we're building something that solves a real problem for real companies in a way that the current market doesn't adequately address. I think the technology is genuinely better, not marginally better. And I think we know that because we see the numbers from Detroit, and the numbers don't lie." She looked around the room. "I also think this company exists because of a specific set of choices that each of you made to come here when it wasn't obvious, when there was a lawsuit and uncertainty, and you had other options. That matters to me." A pause. "I want this company to be one where the people who do the work are recognized for the work, where the names on things are the names of the people who made them." That sounds simple. It's not in this industry. We're going to have to work at it. But that's what I want. Claudia from the back of the room. "Is this in the employee handbook?" "It's in the culture," Nadia said. "Same thing." General laughter. She raised her glass. "To Meridian," she said. "Meridian, see," they answered. The Wired piece had done something she hadn't fully anticipated. It had made her findable. Not famous, she had no interest in famous. And the piece was a business story, not a profile, but visible in the specific way that mattered in the industry. The people who read Wired and cared about enterprise AI had read the piece and come away with a clear picture of who had built what at Vantage and what she was building now. And some of those people were potential customers, and some were potential employees, and some were investors, and some were simply engineers who reached out to say they'd been in similar situations and were glad someone had documented it. She answered as many of those messages as she could. The engineers especially, she answered every one of those. Some of them ended up in conversations about roles at Meridian. 3 of them ultimately joined. The message she thought about most, though, came from a woman named Dr. Amara Diallo, who is a researcher at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, CSAIL, working on problems adjacent to what Meridian was building. The message was 2 paragraphs, one describing her research, one saying that she had read the Wired piece and then read Nadia's original academic paper, and then on the basis of both had a specific technical question she wanted to discuss. Nadia replied in 4 hours, and they had a video call the following week that ran 2 hours past its scheduled time, and at the end of which Nadia said, "I want to make you an offer." "I'm tenured at MIT," Dr. Diallo said. "I know. The offer isn't to leave MIT. It's to serve as a technical advisor with equity in exchange for a specific research collaboration I want to propose." Nadia outlined it. "The output would be publishable. I want the research to be public, not locked in a company. The application to our system would be exclusive for a period after which it enters the academic commons." Dr. Diallo looked at her for a moment. "You're proposing to open source the research output?" "Eventually, yes. I think the field benefits more from the research being public than from us having a permanent moat. We'll build the moat from implementation quality, not from keeping the underlying methodology secret." A silence. Then, that's unusual. I know, Nadia said. I think it's right. Dr. Diallo accepted the following week. She was the first of 3 academic advisors Nadia would recruit over the next year, building a research relationship between Meridian and the academic AI community that would eventually produce 4 papers, all with full attribution to every contributor, including Meridian's engineers who had contributed to the technical validation work. Their names would be in the published record. That was Nadia had decided how this company worked. She Lunch with Sasha Dreyfus happened on a Thursday in April, 3 days after the settlement signed a timing that was coincidental and which Nadia decided not to overthink. Dreyfus was tall, early 50s, with the specific efficiency of a person who had spent 20 years making consequential decisions and had become very comfortable with the discomfort that preceded them. She wore a dark suit and ordered a salad and mineral water, and did not talk about anything except the business for the first 45 minutes, which Nadia found deeply refreshing. The conversation covered the pilot results and the conversion to full contract, the technical architecture and the research collaboration with Dr. Diallo, the team composition and Claudia's VP of engineering role, the competitive landscape and why the current alternatives to Meridian's approach were structurally limited, and the litigation which Dreyfus addressed directly and without drama. The settlement was the right outcome, Dreyfus said. The litigation was a risk and you managed it. What matters now is the trajectory. The trajectory is up, Nadia said. I can see that. Dreyfus set down her fork. Here's what I want to tell you. I've been watching the enterprise AI space for 3 years. I've passed on 4 companies I shouldn't have passed on and back 2 I should have passed on. The pattern I've learned from those mistakes is this. The companies that produce durable value are not the ones with the most compelling narrative. They're the ones where the technology is genuinely differentiated and the person building it understands why. She looked at Nadia steadily. You understand why? Yes, Nadia said. Then let's talk numbers. Dreyfus picked up her pen. What do you need for the next 18 months and what do you think you'll be able to show at the end of it? Nadia told her. Precisely and without embellishment with the numbers she had built on a spreadsheet over 3 months of thinking about exactly this conversation. Dreyfus wrote the relevant figures on her notepad. She asked 4 questions. Nadia answered all 4. Then Dreyfus said, We'd want to lead the round. I'd want Priya's firm to co-lead, Nadia said. She was there when no one else was. That means something to me. Dreyfus looked at her for a moment, assessing Nadia knew not just the business, but the person. The kind of thing you could only do across a table. All right, but, she said, let's structure something. She picked up the check without discussion, which Nadia noted. Outside, the San Francisco April afternoon was doing what April did, the mild, ambiguous quality of a season that hadn't yet committed to what it was going to be. Nadia walked back to the office in the afternoon light, thinking about the conversation, about the numbers, about what the next 18 months needed to look like. She had work to do. She was ready to do it. In May, Nadia gave her first public talk since leaving Vantage. It was at a conference called AI Enterprise Summit in Chicago. 300 attendees, mostly operators and technical leaders at large companies, the kind of audience that cared more about what a system could actually do than about the narrative around it. She had been invited before the Wired piece on the basis of her academic publication and the early word about Meridian's pilot, and she had accepted before the lawsuit and decided after some consideration to keep the commitment. She spoke for 30 minutes about the specific technical problem Meridian was solving, not the marketing version, the real version, with the architecture and the methodology and the data about why current approaches fell short. She showed the Detroit numbers anonymized per the customer's request, but real. She described the research collaboration with Dr. Diallo and the open source commitment. At the end, she said, I want to close with something that's not technical. She paused. I spent 4 years at a company where the technical contribution and the public attribution were significantly misaligned. I've spent the past 8 months building a company specifically designed not to reproduce that misalignment, where the people who do the work are credited for the work where the research outputs are public, and attributed where the engineering decisions are documented and owned by the people who made them. She looked at the room. I think that's not just an ethical position. I think it's a competitive advantage. The best engineers want to work somewhere. Their work means something under their own names. The best researchers want to publish. The best customers want to understand who is actually solving their problem. A pause. Attribution is not a soft value. It is an engineering principle. The applause was longer than she'd expected. 3 people came to find her in the hallway afterward. 2 were potential customers. The third was an engineer from Vantage, one of the 3 who hadn't joined Meridian initially. He said, "I've been thinking about your offer since last fall." "And," she said, "is it still open?" "Call Claudia tomorrow," she said. "She's expecting to hear from you." She'd told Claudia 3 weeks ago that this call was coming. She'd been right. She had spent 4 years learning to read the systems she built. She had gotten equally good at reading the people who built them with her. She took a cab to O'Hare. She had a 5:15 flight. She had work to do in the morning. Marcus resigned as CEO of Vantage AI in June. She found out from Tae Yang, who had seen it on Bloomberg, who texted her the link at 7 a.m. VTG, opened down 11.4% on the news. The press release cited a desire to pursue new ventures and thanked the board and the team and the customers and used 17 other phrases that meant nothing. A statement from the board noted that the company's CFO would serve as interim CEO, while the board conducted a formal search. Nadia read the press release once. She texted Tae Yang, noted. She put her phone down and went back to the design document. She'd been working on the next major architecture feature, the one that would underpin the Series B pitch, and she wrote for 2 hours and produced something she was satisfied with, which was a good morning's work. She thought about Marcus briefly in the way you thought about things that had occupied enormous space in your life, and then through the simple fact of time and work and forward motion contracted to their actual size. She did not feel triumphant. She had not felt triumphant the day the settlement signed either, or the day the Wired piece published, or the day VTG first dropped on the lawsuit news. What she felt across all of those moments was a version of the same thing, the specific confirmation that the choice she'd made to leave to build, to stop negotiating with a situation that was not going to improve, had been correct. The validation was not in Marcus's departure. The validation was in the design document open on her laptop, and in the 14 people in the office down the hall, and in the Detroit customer whose procurement costs were down 23% in the first 6 months. The work was the validation. She had always known that. She had simply needed for a while to rebuild the conditions in which she could do the work honestly. Those conditions existed now. She went back to the document. She wrote, "J'accepte." The Series B closed in August. $34 million, led jointly by Sasha Dreyfus's fund and Priya's firm, with 2 additional investors participating. Total valuation, $190 million pre-money. Nadia was in the office when the wire confirmation came through. She forwarded it to Claudia with a single line. "Round closed. Buy the good champagne again." Claudia replied, "It's already in the fridge. I had a feeling about Thursday." The team meeting that afternoon had the quality of all the best team meetings, not a celebration exactly, but a recognition. A shared understanding that the phase they were in had advanced, that the resources now available were commensurate with the problem they were solving, and that the problem they were solving was worth solving. Nadia talked about what the next 18 months needed to look like: 3 additional enterprise customers in the direct materials category, the research paper with Dr. Diallo's team targeted for submission in Q1, the hiring plan, which would take the team from 14 to 28, and the architecture roadmap for the feature set that would, she believed, expand Meridian's addressable market from procurement into the broader autonomous operations category. She talked for an hour. The team asked good questions. Claudia took notes on the whiteboard, the same whiteboard Nadia noticed where she'd drawn 3 boxes connected by arrows on the first Monday 9 months ago. The boxes had names now. The arrows had timelines. The thing they'd been building had become over 9 months of relentless, careful work. Real in the way that software became real. Deployed, tested, producing results accountable to the evidence. After the meeting, when the team had dispersed back to their laptops and the office had its usual working hour quiet, Nadia sat at her desk and thought about the yellow legal pad term sheet she'd framed and put on her wall at Vantage 3 years ago. She had not brought it with her when she left. She had left it on the wall of the office with Adrian's with Marcus's name on it next to hers because it was a record of something that had happened, and it was not hers alone to take. She had a new piece of paper now. The Meridian Incorporation documents, the first page of which bore only her name. She had not framed it. She kept it in a folder in her desk drawer next to the printed settlement paragraph acknowledging her technical contributions to Vantage. She didn't need it on the wall. She knew what it said. She turned back to her laptop and opened the design document. She had an architecture to finish. 1 year after the IPO bell, VTG was trading at $19.43. It had opened at $28. It had peaked briefly and brilliantly at $41.20 in the second week, the specific euphoria of a newly public tech company before the market began to apply the rigor it applied to everything eventually. Then it had declined in the slow grinding way that companies declined when their product was good, but not as good as the narrative had promised, and when the engineering team was competent but not exceptional, and when the person who had made the core technical decisions had taken the core technical insight and gone somewhere else with it. Nadia did not track VTG's stock price. She had made this a deliberate policy on the day she left Vantage: no monitoring, no checking, no allowing the ticker to function as a referendum on her choices. She found out about the $19.43 because Claudia mentioned it in passing during a Monday stand-up, in the context of noting that 3 more Vantage engineers had reached out in the past week about roles at Meridian. "How many is that total?" Nadia asked. 11 since the Wired piece. "How many have we hired?" 4. 2 more in final conversations. Claudia looked at her notes. "I want to talk to you about the pipeline engineering lead. She's exceptional. Send me her GitHub." Already in your inbox. This was, Nadia thought, one of the things she had built correctly, a hiring process that ran the way a system ran consistently, rigorously, with clear inputs and measurable outputs, in which every decision was documented and attributable. She reviewed every senior hire personally. She knew the name of every engineer in the office. She had built the team the way she built architecture from first principles, with the question of what does this system actually need preceding every decision about what to acquire. The second enterprise customer signed in September, a retail conglomerate based in Minneapolis, with a procurement spend that dwarfed even the Detroit manufacturers. The contract was larger, the scope broader, and the performance expectations commensurately higher. Claudia called it our first terrifying customer. Nadia called it the one that proves the system scales. The Minneapolis deployment was more complex than Detroit. More data sources, more legacy system integrations, more organizational stakeholders with conflicting priorities. Nadia personally led 4 of the 7 technical integration sessions, which was not the norm for a CEO, but which she had decided was the right call for this customer, specifically because the problems they were solving were genuinely interesting and because being present in the room when the system encountered real complexity was how she stayed ahead of the next generation of challenges. At the third integration session, the customer's head of data infrastructure, a man named Robert Cho, who had been visibly skeptical from the first meeting, spent 20 minutes walking through an edge case he'd identified in the system's handling of multi-currency procurement data. He had done real technical preparation. He had found a real limitation. Nadia listened to the full 20 minutes without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You're right. This is a genuine limitation in the current version. Here's why it exists." She explained the architectural decision briefly, and here's what we're going to do about it. She outlined a solution. She named a timeline. She wrote her direct email on a notepad and pushed it across the table. Robert Cho looked at the paper. He looked at her. Then he wrote something on his own notepad and pushed it back. It said, "This is the first time a software vendor has told me I was right about a problem." She laughed the real laugh, surprised. He laughed too slightly. That afternoon, driving back from the client site, Claudia said, "You just made a customer for life." "I solved a problem," Nadia said. "Same thing," Claudia said. The research paper with Dr. Diallo's team submitted to a top-tier AI conference in October, a collaboration that had produced over 6 months of intensive work, a methodology for what Dr. Diallo called adaptive procurement intelligence, a framework for AI systems to update their decision models in real time based on market condition changes without requiring retraining from scratch. The methodology was technically significant and practically useful, and per Nadia's commitment, entirely public. The paper listed 7 authors, Dr. Diallo and 2 of her MIT graduate students, 3 Meridian engineers who had done the implementation and validation work, and Nadia in her role as the architect of the foundational approach, the methodology extended. Nadia had insisted on the Meridian engineers being listed. They had done the work. The paper was in the record. Their names belonged there. The paper was accepted in November. Nadia sent a short note to the engineering team the morning the acceptance came through. Paper accepted. Congratulations to the 7 people whose names are on it, especially the Meridian 3. You did the hard implementation work that made the theoretical contribution real. Jiho, who was one of the 3, replied to the team thread. First paper. This is not how I expected a startup job to go. Nadia replied, Good. It shouldn't be. In the fall of the first year, Tae Yang sent her an article from TechCrunch forwarded without comment, which meant he thought she should read it, and had decided not to editorialize. The piece was about a new initiative that Vantage, AI's board, had announced a formal equity review process for founding team members. Prompted by the article was careful here, attributing without quoting concerns raised by the shareholder litigation that had followed the IPO. The litigation, which Nadia knew about in its broad outlines, had been filed by a group of institutional investors alleging that the pre-IPO equity restructuring had not been adequately disclosed. It was ongoing. As part of the equity review, the article noted, Vantage had retained an independent governance consultant to audit founding team compensation structures from inception through IPO. She read the piece twice. She thought about the cap table documents. She thought about the 14 months of version history. She thought about the board members whose communications had come through in discovery. She sent Tae Yang a single response. The avalanche knows how to find the slope, he replied. Couldn't have said it better. Also, how's Meridian? She replied. Good. We closed the Minneapolis contract. Robert Cho is a believer. The skeptical ones always make the best customers, Tae Yang wrote. Yes, she replied. They do their homework. The Meridian Founders Fellowship launched in November, a program Nadia had been designing quietly for 6 months. She had thought about what to call it for weeks and had landed on founders rather than engineers, because the people she wanted to reach were not necessarily engineers by title. They were people who had founded or co-founded technical organizations, companies, research groups, open source projects, and whose founding contributions had been inadequately recognized. The fellowship offered 6 months of structured support, a small stipend access to Meridian's technical infrastructure for prototyping mentorship from Nadia and 3 other technical advisors she had recruited, and this was the part she had thought about most carefully. A formal contribution documentation framework that created a time-stamped independent record of each fellow's work throughout the program. The documentation framework was not glamorous. It was not a prize or an award or a public recognition in the conventional sense. It was a system, a structured, maintained, legally sound record of what each person had built and when and how, designed specifically to be useful if the fellow ever needed to demonstrate their contributions in a context where those contributions might otherwise be disputed. She had built it, she said in the announcement, which ran in TechCrunch and VentureBeat, and the MIT Technology Review, because she knew from experience that the absence of such a record was not a minor inconvenience. It was a mechanism of erasure. The people most at risk of having their technical contributions undercounted, she wrote in the announcement, are often the people working hardest to make something real. Building a documentation system is not glamorous. But a good system is how you protect what matters, and protecting what matters is how you ensure the work can keep happening. Dr. Diallo shared the piece on her academic network with the note Engineering Ethics Applied. 43 applications arrived in the first week. Nadia read every one. She accepted 8 for the first cohort. She sent personal notes to 4 others she couldn't fund yet, but wanted to stay in contact with. She kept a spreadsheet of names. The first cohort began work in January of Meridian's second year. Their names were in the record from day 1. She had dinner with Priya in December, an end-of-year tradition that had developed naturally over the course of their investor relationship, born of the fact that Priya's firm hosted an annual dinner and Nadia had attended twice, and they had both times ended up talking long after the formal event ended. This year, they sat at a small table at a Japanese restaurant in the Mission after the firm's event with sake and edamame and the specific quality of a conversation between two people who had been direct with each other long enough to skip the preliminary negotiations. "How do you feel about year one?" Priya asked. Nadia considered the question honestly. Year one had been 8 months of pre-incorporation groundwork. Incorporation in Series A, the lawsuit and the settlement, 2 enterprise customers, the research paper, the Series B, the fellowship launch, 14 people grown to 22. She had slept an average of 6 hours a night. She had not taken a vacation. She had worked every Saturday morning, which she'd decided was acceptable, and most Sunday afternoons, which she'd decided she needed to address in year two. "Harder than I expected," she said. "Better than I hoped." "The customers are the thing," Priya said. "The technology I believed in from the second meeting. The customers tell me the technology is real in the way that matters in the world with consequences." "They tell me that too," Nadia said. "Every time Robert Cho sends me a data question, I think this is someone who's staking real money on whether our system works. That's the accountability I trust more than any other." "What does year two look like?" 3 more enterprise customers. The first version of the autonomous operations category product, that's the adjacent market I've been designing toward. The second research paper on the adaptive methodology applied to logistics. And she paused. "I want to take 2 actual weeks off, in a place without reliable internet." Priya raised an eyebrow. "Is that in the operating plan?" "It should be," Nadia said. "I've told Claudia. She's supportive. Possibly too supportive, which tells me she's been waiting for me to suggest it." Priya smiled, the real one, not the professional one. "You've built something good, Nadia." "We have," she said. "All 22 of us." 22, Priya agreed. "And growing." Outside San Francisco was doing December, the cold, that wasn't quite cold enough, the particular quality of city light, in the month when everyone was simultaneously exhausted and optimistic. Nadia walked back to her car in the evening air and thought about the year behind her and the year ahead. She had built Meridian Systems. It was real and it was working and it was hers, and her team's documented and attributed and recorded accurately. She had 14 months of work ahead of her before she took those 2 weeks off. She was ready. But year two started the way every year started, with a problem she hadn't anticipated and a solution she built from scratch. The problem arrived in January, 3 weeks into Meridian's second year, in the form of a security audit that flagged a vulnerability in the data pipeline's handling of cross-tenant data isolation. Not a breach. Nothing had been compromised, but a potential exposure that required immediate architectural attention. Nadia spent 4 days in the office with Claudia and the 2 engineers most familiar with the pipeline, working through the fix with the specific, unhurried attention that security work required, because the wrong fix was worse than no fix. On the 4th day at 9 p.m., when the fix was confirmed and tested and deployed, and the audit trail documented, Claudia said, "I keep forgetting you're the CEO." "I'm the CEO who wrote the original pipeline," Nadia said. "This is not above my pay grade. It's below your organizational grade. Those are different things." She closed her laptop. "The pipeline is my architecture. When it has a problem, I want to understand the problem. That's not a management philosophy, that's engineering discipline." Claudia considered this. "Fair," she said, "but you should sleep." She slept. The pipeline was clean in the morning. Matt. The third enterprise customer signed in February, a pharmaceutical company whose procurement complexity made the first 2 customers look straightforward, with 17 countries, 43 currencies, and a regulatory compliance overlay that required a custom module Nadia had been designing in parallel with the sales process for 8 months. The contract was the largest to date, a 5-year agreement with expansion provisions. After it signed, she sat in a conference call with Janet Wu, the Detroit customer, the first one who had become something like a genuine professional reference, and occasionally an informal advisor on the product direction, and described the pharmaceutical deployment. 17 countries, Janet said. 17 countries, Nadia confirmed. Jiho built the multi-currency module. He's also going to submit the methodology to the systems architecture conference. Is that you let your engineers publish? I require it, Nadia said. If the work is solid enough to deploy, it's solid enough to publish. And published work is how the best engineers know where to come. A pause. You're unusual, Janet said. I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. I know, Nadia said. So did everyone else who said it. Janet laughed. It was the kind of laugh that contained genuine appreciation, the laugh of someone who had spent 20 years working with technology vendors and had developed a finely calibrated sense of the difference between a vendor who performed relationship and a vendor who was actually good. How many customers do you have now? She asked. 3 active deployments, 2 more in negotiation. By this time next year. 8, Nadia said. That's the plan. Call me if you need a reference. I'll call you before that, Ma, Nadia said. I want your product feedback on the next major release. You find things nobody else finds. Because I actually use it, Janet said. Exactly, Pat, Nadia said. Whoa. In March, the shareholder litigation against Vantage AI settled. The terms were not public, but the press coverage noted that the settlement included the resignation of 2 board members, the 2 whose communications had been most directly implicated by the discovery documents, and a commitment to an independent governance review of the company's founding equity practices. Nadia read the piece on her phone during a commute and then put the phone away. She had said what she had to say about Vantage in the settlement paragraph. The rest was not her story to tell. In April, Dr. Diallo's team submitted the second research paper, the one on adaptive methodology applied to logistics, to a journal. 6 authors this time, including 4 Meridian engineers who had done the implementation work. The paper would be accepted in June and published in September, and when it was published, it would be cited by 2 academic research groups and 3 other AI companies working on adjacent problems. The Meridian engineers' names would be in the citations. She made sure of that. The event she had not planned for happened in May, a profile in the New York Times business section. She had been careful over the course of 2 years to control her public presence interviews with technical press conference talks on specific technical topics, the Wired piece, and the settlement and the fellowship announcement. What she had not sought was a personal profile. She was building a company, not a brand, and she was aware that the two were easily confused and that the confusion was usually expensive. The Times reporter had reached out in February through 3 different channels before Nadia agreed to talk. She had agreed because the reporter's previous work, she had read 6 of her pieces before the first call, was technically precise and narratively honest, the combination she trusted. The profile ran on a Thursday. The headline was, "She built the technology that made her partner rich. Then she built something better." It was, Nadia thought, reading it at her desk that morning with coffee, accurate. Not complete. No 3,000-word profile could be complete but accurate. It described the founding of Vantage, her technical role, the cap table document, her departure, and the 8 months of groundwork before incorporation. It described Meridian, the team, the customers, the research, the fellowship. It quoted Priya, Claudia, Janet, Wu, Dr. Diallo, and Robert Cho. It quoted the settlement paragraph verbatim. The final paragraph quoted Nadia directly from an interview session she barely remembered. "The thing I care about is that the work is real and the record is accurate. If the work is real and the record is accurate, everything else follows from that. If either of those things is missing, nothing else works, not sustainably, not for long." She read that sentence and thought, yes, that is exactly what I think. Her phone started ringing at 7:30 and did not stop for the rest of the day. She answered the ones that mattered. The rest went to voicemail. At 8 p.m., when the office was quiet and she was finally alone with the day's accumulated emails and the architecture document she'd been meaning to work on all day, and hadn't she thought about what the profile would produce, the attention, the interest, the noise that preceded signal, and whether she was ready for it? She thought about the question she'd asked herself in a Hayes Valley coffee shop 14 months ago, watching the Vantage IPO bell ring on her phone giving herself 43 minutes to feel the full weight of it before the 10:15 meeting. She was more ready now than she had been then. She had a company and a team and 3 customers and 2 research papers and a fellowship cohort and an architecture she believed in. She was ready. She opened the architecture document. She wrote until midnight. It was a good night's work. The Times profile produced in the 30 days after it published the following 14 inbound enterprise sales inquiries. 22 engineering job applications from people she would not ordinarily have reached a call from a think tank in Washington that wanted her to speak at a policy forum on AI governance and intellectual property. 2 speaking invitations she declined when she accepted, and a message from a woman named Yuki Tanaka, who was a co-founder of a robotics startup in Osaka, and who had the message said, "Been in a situation remarkably similar to Nadia's 2 years earlier, and had read the piece 3 times." She replied to Yuki Tanaka first. She had developed a habit over the course of the 2 years of replying to the messages from people in similar situations, first before the investor calls, before the press inquiries, before the customer follow-ups. Not because those messages were the most strategically important, but because they were the ones where a prompt reply made the most difference to the actual person on the other end. She had received since the Wired piece 41 such messages. She had replied to all 41. 3 of them had led to further conversations. One of those had led to a fellowship application. The fellow was currently in her first cohort, building a prototype of something Nadia thought was genuinely interesting. Yuki Tanaka's situation was different from Nadia's, different industry, different company structure, different legal jurisdiction. But the underlying mechanism was recognizable. A founding technical contributor whose equity position had been restructured without adequate disclosure before a significant liquidity event. Nadia put her in touch with Taiyang, who knew a counterpart in Tokyo with the relevant expertise. She did not know what happened next. She was not the right person to resolve it, but she was the right person to know the next person, and knowing the next person was sometimes the whole thing. The autonomous operations product. The category expansion she had been designing toward since the beginning, launched in beta in June, 18 months after incorporation. 7 customers had access in the initial beta, including the 3 existing enterprise customers and 4 new ones who had come in specifically for the new product. The beta period was 90 days. The feedback would determine the production timeline. At the 45-day mark of the beta, Janet Wu sent a message, "Your autonomous operations module just flagged a supplier risk event 3 weeks before our existing monitoring system would have caught it. We avoided a $4 million disruption. I want to talk about expanding our contract." Nadia forwarded it to Claudia with one line, "This is what it's for." Claudia forwarded it to the engineering team with one line, "Jiho built the supplier risk engine. Please congratulate Jiho." The team channel lit up with congratulations. Jiho characteristically replied, "It was a team build. I wrote the inference layer. 3 other people built the data connectors and the alert system." Nadia added to the thread, "All 4 names are in the commit history. Good work." This was the culture she had built, not by policy, by practice, repeated consistently in the small moments where it was easier to give one person the credit than to be precise about who had done what. She had chosen to be precise. Every time. Even when it slowed things down. Even when it was administratively inconvenient. The commit history was not glamorous. It was the record. The record was the thing. Gitet. In August, she took 2 weeks off. She went to Accra to see her mother, which she had been planning to do for 18 months. She stayed in the house she'd grown up in the guest room that still had the civil engineering textbook she'd borrowed from her mother's office at 12 and never returned. She ate her mother's cooking and argued pleasantly with her brothers, and went to the beach twice and read 4 novels that had nothing to do with enterprise AI or Silicon Valley or anything she was building. On the last evening, sitting with her mother on the veranda in the warm Accra night, her mother asked, "Are you happy?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about the 22 people in the Soma office. She thought about Robert Cho's notepad. She thought about Jiho's first published paper. She thought about Yuki Tanaka and Taeyang's Tokyo counterpart and the fellowship cohort and the architect document that was always perpetually partially finished and perpetually growing. Yes, she said, not the way I expected to be, but yes. Her mother nodded once. Then go back and finish it. I'm not finished yet, Nadia said. I know, her mother said. That's why I said finish it. She flew back to San Francisco on a Sunday. She was at her desk on Monday morning at 6 with coffee and the architecture document and the specific rested quality of a person who had been genuinely away and was genuinely back. She had 22 people and 6 enterprise customers and a beta product that had just demonstrated its value in the clearest possible way. Dollars saved risk avoided evidence in the world. She had work to do. She always had work to do. She was finally and completely doing it under her own name in her own company, on her own terms. That was the whole thing. That was enough. 2 years after the Vantage IPO, Meridian Systems had 28 engineers, 6 enterprise customers, and a Series B that was 18 months into its deployment. The autonomous operations product had converted from beta to general availability in October, and the first 3 customers who had used it in beta had expanded their contracts within 60 days of GA, the specific commercial signal that meant the product was solving a real problem and not just a demo problem. Nadia tracked the company's progress, not by the metrics that investors watched most closely, ARR, growth net revenue retention logo count, but by a different set of numbers she kept in a private spreadsheet that she updated every Friday morning before the team arrived. The spreadsheet had 6 columns names of engineers who had shipped significant features, the features they'd shipped, the date, the customer impact, whether the work had been acknowledged publicly within the team, and whether any of it was eligible for external publication or patent documentation. She updated it herself. It took 20 minutes a week. It was, she had decided early in Meridian's life, the most important 20 minutes of her week. The spreadsheet was not visible to the team. It was her accounting, her private ledger of the work, and the people doing it maintained against the moment when someone needed to know exactly who had built what and could produce the evidence. She had learned to keep that accounting. She had learned it the hard way. In October, the Meridian Founders Fellowship completed its second cohort. The second cohort was 12 fellows, larger than the first 8, reflecting the demand from the application pool and a funding increase that Sasha Dreyfus's firm had contributed specifically for the program. The fellows had spent 6 months working on technical projects across a range of domain: AI materials, science, biotech, clean energy. 3 of them were building companies. 2 were leading research projects. The remaining 7 were in various stages of the work that preceded, knowing clearly what they were building. All 12 had the documentation framework. All 12 had time-stamped records of their contributions from day 1 of the program. 3 of them had, over the course of the 6 months, already needed to reference those records, 2 in conversations with potential investors who wanted to understand founding contribution history, 1 in a preliminary discussion with an attorney about a prior employer's equity practices. The documentation had been useful. That was the only metric Nadia cared about for the program. The closing ceremony, she had resisted the word ceremony and lost because Claudia had pointed out that people who had done something significant were entitled to a room that acknowledged it was held at Meridian's office, which had grown to occupy the 3rd floor of a building in Soma with a view of the bay on clear days and the top of the Bay Bridge on days that were merely good. Nadia spoke for 15 minutes. She described what the program had been designed to do and what it had actually done, which were close but not identical, which was how she knew it was working. The gap between design and outcome. In year 1 had informed the design of year 2, and the same would be true of year 3. What I want to tell you, she said, looking at the 12 fellows, is something I didn't fully understand when I started building this program. I thought the most important thing the fellowship could give you was time. Time to work on your project without the pressure of immediate commercial viability. Time to think. I still believe that, but I've watched 2 cohorts now, and what I've seen is that the most important thing is something simpler. She paused. It's being in a room where your contribution is expected to be documented, where the default is attribution, not anonymity, where the question, who built this, has an answer that goes in the record. She looked around the room at the fellows, at Claudia, at Dr. Diallo, who had come down from MYT for the event, at Priya and Sasha Dreyfus, who had both made the trip. Most of the systems you'll work inside for the rest of your careers will default to the other thing. They will default to the credit going to the most visible person, to the most senior person, to the person who presents the work, rather than the person who did it. You will have to fight consistently and deliberately to maintain the record. A silence. But you've spent 6 months in a room where the default was different. That's what I hope you take with you. Not the documentation system, you can build your own version of that. The expectation. The understanding that documenting your work is not a bureaucratic chore. It is the foundational act of professional integrity. She stopped. The room was very quiet. Then Dr. Diallo from the second row started the applause. In November, Nadia met Marcus for the second time since leaving Vantage. The first time had been the doorway encounter Hayes Valley. February brief and strange, and complete in its way. The second time was at an industry conference in San Jose that they had both apparently agreed to attend without knowing the other would be there, which was the kind of thing that happened in a field that was simultaneously enormous and narrow. She saw him across the conference hall at the opening reception, the silver in his hair a bit more pronounced than she remembered. The posture still excellent, the practiced ease of a public figure still visible, but operating at a lower wattage. He had started a new company she knew from the press, an AI safety advisory firm, which she found neither surprising nor ironic, merely data. He saw her at approximately the same moment she saw him. There was a fraction of a second in which both of them registered the encounter and made the same calculation whether to approach or to allow the crowd to provide natural separation. She walked over. She had decided at some point in the past year, without consciously articulating it, that she was done organizing her movements around avoiding Marcus Hale. The space she occupied was hers. She moved through it the way she chose. "Nadia," he said. "Marcus," she said. They shook hands, which was either formal or natural, depending on how you looked at it, and she had long since decided not to analyze such things. "Congratulations on the Times piece," he said. He meant it, she thought, or meant it in the specific way that people meant things when the thing had also cost them something. "Thank you," she said. A pause. The conference hall moved around them in its usual way, people in motion, conversations overlapping the ambient noise of an industry convening. "The fellowship," he said. "I've heard good things. Priya mentioned it. We're in our second cohort. Is it—" he stopped. "Is it working? What you designed it to do?" She looked at him for a moment. It was a real question. She could tell after 4 years of working with him what his real questions sounded like, and this was one of them. "Yes," she said. "It's working." He nodded. Something moved through his expression that she didn't try to classify. "That's good," he said. "That should exist." She thought about the 14 months of cap table versions. She thought about the settlement paragraph. She thought about the first Monday at the whiteboard in the Soma co-working space, and Dr. Diallo and Robert Cho's notepad, and Jiho's first published paper and 28 engineers in an office with a view of the bay. "It does now," she said. She excused herself. She moved through the conference hall toward the session she'd come for, a technical panel on enterprise AI architecture that had 3 speakers she wanted to hear and several she wanted to talk to afterward. She did not look back. She had not built the habit of looking back. The Series C conversation began in December. It had not been in the plan. The 18-month plan from the Series B had contemplated Series C readiness at month 24, and they were at month 22, but 3 inbound expressions of interest from funds she respected had arrived in a 2-week window in November. And Priya had called and said, "The market is telling you something. It's worth listening." She listened. She had a preliminary conversation with each of the 3 funds. She spent a week with Claudia and her CFO. They'd hired a CFO at month 18, a woman named Beatrice Nakamura, who had built financial infrastructure at 3 successful B2B companies, and who had the specific talent for making complex financial structures legible without oversimplifying them, modeling the scenarios. What she determined at the end of the week was that the company didn't need a Series C yet, but it was ready for one. And being ready was a resource she could deploy strategically rather than reactively. She told Sasha Dreyfus this on a Thursday call. Dreyfus was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to make them wait." "I'm going to take the conversations at a pace that reflects our leverage, not their timeline," Nadia said. "We have runway, we have momentum. We have 3 customers who have expanded and 2 more in final negotiations. We can afford to be deliberate. You could, Dreyfus said. Most founders can't resist moving quickly when the interest is there. Most founders haven't spent 8 months building a company before they raised their first dollar, Nadia said. I learned patience from a circumstance I didn't choose. I might as well use it. Dreyfus laughed the genuine laugh, the one that appeared rarely, and was always Nadia had come to understand the sign of something true. Fair, she said. Let's talk in January about process. January. Nadia agreed. She had 28 engineers, 6 customers, 2 completed fellowship cohorts, 3 Series C expressions of interest she was in no hurry to act on, and an architecture document that was currently on page 74 of what would eventually be the technical specification for the next major product direction. She thought, sitting at her desk at 9 p.m. on a Thursday in December, the bay view dark through the office window, the city lights doing their usual impersonation of permanent, exactly the company she had wanted to build. Not finished. Never finished. The point was that it wasn't finished, that there was always more system to build, more problem to solve. More engineers whose names needed to be in the record of what they'd made. But real. Accountable. Hers. She closed the architecture document. She put on her coat. She turned off her desk lamp. She went home. She set her alarm for 5:30. There was work to do in the morning. There was always work to do in the morning. That was, she had decided exactly how she liked it. January brought the 3rd cohort of the fellowship, the Series C process, and a call from Yuki Tanaka in Osaka that lasted 90 minutes. Yuki had resolved her situation not perfectly, not in the way that legal and corporate disputes resolved in movies, but in the specific pragmatic way that real situations resolved when the people involved were smart and the legal position was sound, and the other party calculated that prolonged conflict was more expensive than a settlement. She had received formal acknowledgement of her technical contributions. She had received equity that better reflected her founding role. She told Nadia, started rebuilding. I want to ask you something, Yuki said. She had good English, precise, and slightly formal, with the quality of someone who had learned it professionally rather than colloquially. The fellowship, is it only for American founders? No, Nadia said. It's for anyone whose situation fits the criteria. The documentation framework can it be adapted for different legal jurisdictions. That's exactly what we've been working on, Nadia said. She pulled up a file she'd been building for 3 months. We've been developing jurisdiction-specific guidance with 3 legal partners in the UK, Japan, and Germany. The core documentation principles are the same everywhere. The legal utility varies by jurisdiction. A silence. Then, I want to bring someone to your next cohort. Tell me about them. Yuki described a hardware engineer in her network who had over 4 years developed the core sensing technology underlying a robotics company, whose founder had just announced a Series B without adequate attribution to the engineer's contributions. The situation had the familiar shape. Send me their information, Nadia said. We'll review the application. The engineer was accepted into the 3rd cohort 3 weeks later. Her name went into the documentation framework on day 1. The Series C closed in April, $72 million, at a valuation that Beatrice had modeled in 3 scenarios and which landed in the upper portion of the range she'd projected. The lead was a new fund Nadia hadn't previously worked with, based in New York, that had built a reputation for backing technical founders, specifically the CTO turned CEO profile that the VC world had historically been ambivalent about. The partners had been direct in the diligence process about why they were interested, the research papers, the fellowship, the customer retention rate, and what one of them called in a diligence call, the absence of founder-product market confusion, by which he meant the company was building what the founder understood, and the founder understood it because she had built the foundational technology herself. Nadia had said, that's a polite way of saying you want to back founders who can read their own code. He'd laughed. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. The Series C announcement ran in TechCrunch, VentureBeat, and the Wall Street Journal. The WSJ piece included a line that Nadia read twice. Meridian Systems, founded by former Vantage AI co-founder Nadia Osei. Following a widely reported equity dispute, has raised $72 million in a Series C round, establishing itself as one of the leading companies in the enterprise autonomous operations category it largely defined. Largely defined. She read that phrase and thought about the whiteboard and the three boxes and the first Monday and the reinforcement learning architecture and the 12 people who were now 28 and the 6 customers who were becoming 8. She had defined the category. With her team. With 28 people whose names were in the commit history and the research papers and the architecture documents and the contribution logs that Beatrice maintained with the same rigor that Nadia had originally established. The record was accurate. The work was real. In May, the second research paper, the one on adaptive methodology applied to logistics, was published in the journal. The paper was cited within 90 days of publication by 11 other research groups. One of the citing papers was from a team at DeepMind. Another was from a group at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Ji Ho, whose name was the third of 6 on the author list, sent a message to the team channel that was 2 words: "We exist." Nadia replied, "We always did. Now the database knows." The team channel erupted. Even the engineers, who rarely posted anything except commit notifications, contributed something. Claudia sent a GIF that Nadia didn't recognize, but that the rest of the team apparently found extremely funny. Robert Cho, who was on a customer mailing list Claudia had started for significant company milestones, sent a 3-word reply from Detroit, well-deserved. "Congrats." She spent 10 minutes on the thread that morning. Then she closed Slack and went back to the architecture document. Page 91. The next product direction was taking shape. She could see the structure of it now, the way the autonomous operations category could extend from procurement and logistics into the broader question of enterprise decision intelligence, and what that required architecturally, and who on the team had the background to lead the component engineering, and how the research collaboration with Dr. Diallo's lab mapped onto the new direction. She wrote for 2 hours. The document grew. The shape became clearer. This was the work. Always the work. The engineering, the architecture, the careful building of something real, and then the equally careful building of the record that said who had made it real with what contribution at what cost, documented in the way that protected both the work and the people who did it. She had learned to do both. She was good at both. She would spend the rest of her career doing both in companies and through the fellowship and in the papers that carried names in the author list and the commit histories that carried names in the log. The record would be accurate. She would make sure of it. She went back to page 91. She wrote, down in June, 20 months after Meridian's incorporation, 8 months after the Series B, 2 months after the Series C. Nadia sat in the conference room on the 3rd floor with Claudia and Beatrice and the 2 newest members of the leadership team, reviewing the quarterly numbers that Beatrice had prepared. The numbers were good. Not spectacular. She had learned to distrust spectacular in favor of solid, and solid was what they had, but demonstrably consistently good. 7 enterprise customers. Net revenue retention at 134%. 2 pilot customers in final negotiations. The autonomous operations category was being named in industry analyst reports as a distinct market segment, which was the external validation that a category existed. "The analyst report names us first," Claudia said, pointing to the relevant paragraph. "Because we shipped first," Nadia said. "Not because of the press. Can I put it in the Series C deck retrospective? Put the shipping date in the deck. Let the date speak." Claudia made a note. Beatrice moved to the next slide. The meeting continued with the efficiency of a team that had been doing this long enough to know what mattered and to talk about what mattered without ceremony. After the meeting, Nadia stayed in the conference room for a few minutes while the others filed out. She looked at the whiteboard, not the original one from the co-working space, but the one in this room which had been used for 50 different sessions and whose ghost marks imperfectly erased created a palimpsest of 2 years of thinking. 3 boxes connected by arrows. The beginning. 91 pages of architecture document, where they were now. She picked up the marker. She drew a new box on the clean section of the whiteboard, the fourth box, the one that was coming next, the category expansion she'd been designing toward for 8 months. She connected it to the existing 3 with an arrow. She put the cap back on the marker. She went back to her desk. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She thought, sitting at her desk in the afternoon light with the bay visible through the window and the sounds of 28 engineers doing the work she had taught them to document precisely where she had decided to be doing, precisely what she had decided to do with precisely the people she had chosen to do it with. She had lost a company. She had built a better one. She had lost a partner. She had built a team. She had lost for a period the accurate record of her own work. She had made the record accurate. That was the whole story, or the first chapter of it. The chapters after this one would be written by 28 people and then 35 and then 50 with their names in the commit history and the papers and the contribution logs and the culture that said the work is real and the record is accurate, and both of those things matter. She opened the architecture document. Page 91. She wrote, Mamtiki. The year-end review happened in December, in the same conference room with the same people plus 4 additions to the leadership team, a head of research who had come from academia, a VP of sales who had spent 12 years in enterprise software, a head of people who had built the culture practices at 2 companies Nadia respected, and a general counsel who had come specifically because she had read the fellowship documentation framework and wanted to build something similar for Meridian's internal IP practices. The numbers: 8 customers, 142%, NRR, $18.3 million, ARR 28, engineers growing to 35 by Q2. The research: 2 papers, published, a 3rd in review, a 4th in early collaboration with a new academic partner in Singapore. The fellowship 3 cohorts completed 46 fellows in total, 11 of whom had published founded companies or secured patents under their own names within 12 months of completing the program. 46 names in the record. That number, more than any of the commercial metrics, was the one that Nadia wrote in her personal year-end note, the document she kept for herself. Private, updated annually, that tracked not the company's performance, but what the company had actually done in the world. The general counsel. Her name was Patricia Walsh, and she had been in the role for 3 months, and was already, Nadia thought, one of the best hires she'd made, stayed after the others left, which she sometimes did when she had something to say that didn't require an audience. The documentation framework, Patricia said. I want to propose something. Go ahead. I want to open source it, not just the concept, the actual system, the technical architecture, the legal templates, the jurisdiction-specific guidance. All of it public, free, usable by any company or individual who wants to implement it. Nadia looked at her. That eliminates any competitive moat we have in the fellowship. Yes, Patricia said, but it also means the framework is in the world in a way that doesn't depend on us continuing to fund the fellowship. Companies can implement it independently. Research institutions can use it. Individuals can use it without applying to our program. You're proposing that we give away the framework to make the framework more impactful than the fellowship can make it. Yes. A pause. You open sourced the research methodology. Same principle. Nadia was quiet for a moment. She thought about the principle, the one she'd articulated to the 2nd cohort about attribution being an engineering principle. She thought about whether that principle was consistent with keeping the documentation framework proprietary. It wasn't, she decided. The principle required consistency. Draft the open source license, she said. I want to review the framework documentation first, make sure it's clean enough to release without the context of the program behind it. Already drafted, Patricia said. She put a document on the table. I've been working on it for 6 weeks. Nadia picked it up. She read the first 2 pages. It was as she would have predicted from 3 months of working with Patricia Walsh. Exactly right. Good, she said. Let's release it in January. Patricia nodded, gathered her things, and left. Nadia sat in the conference room alone with the year-end quiet around her. Outside the window, the San Francisco December night was doing what it did, cold and clear and full of light, the bay invisible in the dark, but present the way things were present when you'd been looking at them long enough to know they were there. She thought about 46 names. She thought about page 91 of the architecture document. She thought about her mother on the veranda in Accra saying, "Go back and finish it." She was not finished. She would not be finished for a long time. That was precisely the point. She put on her coat. She turned off the conference room light. She went home. Tomorrow she would open the architecture document and write page 92. That was how it went. That was how all good things went. One page at a time, one name in the record at a time. Building, 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 never stopping, never done. And exactly right. 3 years after the Vantage IPO, Bell Meridian Systems had 41 engineers, 11 enterprise customers, and a product suite that had expanded precisely as Nadia had designed from procurement intelligence into the broader category of enterprise autonomous operations. VTG was trading at $14.60. She knew this because Claudia had mentioned it again. Claudia, who maintained a specific and probably unnecessary awareness of VTG's price, and who Nadia had long since decided to find endearing rather than problematic. The stock had never recovered the narrative momentum of its first week. The technical leadership had turned over twice. The product had received 2 major updates, neither of which had resolved the fundamental limitation that Nadia had identified 2 years before she left the architecture was not designed for the kind of adaptive behavior that enterprise operations required at scale. She had built that. She had built the thing that fixed the limitation. The 4 boxes on the whiteboard connected by arrows were now a product suite in production at 11 companies across 4 industries. The record was accurate. The open source documentation framework launched in January of year 3, released under a Creative Commons license with full technical documentation, legal templates for 4 jurisdictions, and a contribution guide that Patricia Walsh had spent 2 months writing with the specific clarity of someone who wanted it to be used rather than admired. The reception exceeded what Nadia had anticipated, which was saying something because she had anticipated significant interest. Within the first week, 4,200 downloads, 14 GitHub stars from researchers at institutions she respected, 3 messages from companies who had already implemented a partial version and wanted to discuss integration questions, 1 message from a law firm in London that wanted to use the legal templates as the basis for a pro bono service for founder disputes. The law firm message she forwarded to Patricia with a note, "Talk to them." This is the right use of what we built. Patricia met with them the following week. A collaboration began. The London firm's pro bono service offering the documentation framework with legal support to founding teams that couldn't afford commercial counsel launched 6 months later. 46 fellows from Meridian's program. Unknown number from the open source release. The framework was in the world. It would outlast the fellowship. It would outlast Meridian eventually. That was Nadia had decided the appropriate ambition for something that mattered. In February, Nadia spoke at MIT. Not a conference talk, but a seminar for graduate students in the computer science and electrical engineering departments arranged by Dr. Diallo. The room held 60 students. She spoke without slides for 45 minutes about technical co-founding equity structures, documentation practices, and the specific question of how engineers should think about the relationship between their technical contributions and their professional identity. She said, "The best technical work you do in your career will in some cases be credited accurately, and in other cases be credited to someone else, or not credited at all. This is not a speculation, it is a statistical likelihood given how technical organizations currently operate. I'm telling you this not to discourage you, but because I want you to understand that documentation is a technical discipline, not an administrative one." She described the documentation framework. She described the commit history and the architecture decision logs and the time-stamped contribution records and what they could and could not protect and why the distinction mattered. A student in the third row, young, sharp-faced, the particular focus of someone who had a specific question they'd been saving, asked, "What if you're already in the situation? What if you're in a company right now where you think the attribution is wrong and you don't have the documentation?" Nadia looked at her. "Start today, was," she said. "Right now, tonight when you get home. You cannot document what's already happened in the past with the same force as contemporaneous records. But you can document going forward. And the pattern of going forward combined with whatever you do have from before creates a record. An incomplete record is better than no record. The student wrote something down. After the seminar, she came to find Nadia. Her name was Leila Ahmadi. She had been, for the past 2 years, the lead engineer on a research project whose PI principal investigator, the academic equivalent of a company founder, had published 2 papers without adequate attribution to the graduate students who had done the implementation work. Nadia listened for 20 minutes. Then she put Leila in touch with Dr. Diallo, who had navigated academic attribution questions for 30 years and knew the landscape precisely. She also added Leila's name to the fellowship application shortlist for the next cohort. 6 weeks later, Leila submitted a full application. 3 weeks after that, she was accepted. Her name went into the documentation framework on day 1. The 4th enterprise customer expansion happened in March. Janet Wu's company, expanding the Meridian deployment from direct materials into indirect spend, a category that tripled the contract value, and represented Janet had told her on the call, the most significant change in how we run procurement in my 20 years in this function. Nadia sent a message to the team. After the call, Janet Wu just told me the deployment represents the most significant change in her procurement function in 20 years. I want to recognize the engineers who built what made that possible. She named 6 people. She cited the specific features each had built. 6 replies came back within an hour. The one from Jiho said, "This is why we document," she replied. "This is exactly why." In June, 3 years and 8 months after the Vantage IPO, Nadia was invited to give the keynote at an enterprise AI conference in New York, the same conference Marcus had keynoted 3 years earlier before the IPO, in the period when he was the face of a company whose technology Nadia had built. She was aware of this. She had looked it up when the invitation arrived because she wanted to know if it was relevant and had decided it was not. She accepted the invitation because the conference had 2,000 attendees and the talk she wanted to give needed an audience of that size. The talk was not about Meridian. It was about documentation about the open source framework and the fellowship and what it had produced in 3 years. She showed the numbers: 46 fellows in 4 cohorts, 4,000, 200 framework downloads, the London law firm's pro bono service, the 11 companies whose names were in the settlement paragraph, analogs that the framework had helped produce. She showed the research papers, not Meridian specifically, but a data set she had assembled with Dr. Diallo's help over 6 months, a systematic review of attributions in AI research publications over the past decade, comparing stated author contributions to what commit histories and internal documentation revealed about who had actually done the implementation work. The gap she showed was significant and consistent. It ran in a predictable direction. She did not editorialize about the direction. She said, "The solution to a documentation problem is documentation. The solution to a systematic attribution problem is systematic documentation. This is not a political argument. It is an engineering argument. Systems produce what they are designed to produce. If the system is designed without a documentation component, it produces work without accurate attribution. If you add the documentation component, you produce the other thing." She showed the framework on the screen. Every slide, every template, the URL for the GitHub repository. "This is free," she said. "Use it." The applause ran longer than she expected. Several people in the audience had their phones out photographing the GitHub URL. Afterward, at the cocktail reception, a man found her who introduced himself as the head of engineering at a company she had heard of, a major enterprise software platform, 1,500 engineers publicly traded. He said, "We've been thinking about implementing a contribution documentation practice. I've read the framework. I have 2 questions." "Go ahead," she said. They talked for 40 minutes standing in the corner of the reception hall while the party moved around them. His questions were good, specific, technically grounded, the questions of someone who had thought seriously about the problem and wanted to think about it more rigorously. By the end, she had given him Patricia Walsh's email for the legal template questions and Claudia's email for the implementation process questions. "Who should I follow up with on the engineering side?" he asked. "Me," she said. "These questions are mine." She flew back to San Francisco on a red-eye which she had learned to stop apologizing for. The red-eye was efficient, and she slept well on planes, which was one of the things she had discovered about herself in 3 years of running a company that required her to be in rooms in multiple cities. She landed at 6 a.m. She went home. She showered, changed, made coffee. She was at her desk at 7:30. The architecture document was on page 114. The fourth product direction, the decision intelligence category. The expansion she had been designing for almost a year was taking its final shape. She could see the structure of it now, the way she could see the structure of all the best systems she'd designed. Not completely, not in every detail, but in the essential relationships between the components, the way each part existed in service of the whole. She wrote for 3 hours. The document grew. The shape became clearer. At 10:30, Claudia knocked on her office door. "Morning, how was New York?" "Good talk," Nadia said. "Good audience. Head of engineering from Hartfield Software wants to implement the framework." "Hartfield," Claudia looked impressed. "That's 1,500 engineers." 1,500 engineers with a documentation practice in 18 months. Nadia said, "If their implementation goes the way he described, 1,500 more names in the record." "Yes," Nadia said. "That's the point." Claudia sat down. "Beatrice wants to schedule the Series D preliminary conversations for Q3. She thinks the timing is right." "It probably is." Nadia turned back to the document. "Tell her Q3 is fine. I want to finish this architecture spec first." "How close are you, Shep?" "Page 114. Out of—" "I don't know yet," Nadia said. "However many pages it takes to get it right." Claudia smiled. She stood up. "I'll tell Beatrice Q3. She left. The office was quiet. The bay was visible through the window, the blue of it, the light on the water, the Bay Bridge in the middle distance doing its perpetual impersonation of something that would last forever. Nadia turned back to the document. Page 114. She wrote, Epilogue. 4 years after. In October of Meridian's 4th year, the company crossed $50 million in ARR. Beatrice sent the number to Nadia in a text at 7 a.m. on the day it registered because Beatrice was the kind of CFO who understood which numbers you sent immediately and which ones you saved for the board deck. This was the kind you sent immediately. Nadia read the text at her desk, where she had already been for an hour working on the architecture document. Page 131. She texted back, "Good. Share it with the team today." Beatrice replied, "Already done." Claudia is buying the champagne again. She put her phone down and wrote 2 more pages before the team started arriving. The fellowship had its 5th cohort in residence. 63 fellows in total across all cohorts. 19 had published. 8 had founded companies. 12 had secured patents under their own names. 4 had used the documentation framework in legal proceedings and prevailed. The open source release had been downloaded 41,000 times. The London law firm's pro bono service had served 93 clients. The Hartfield software implementation had gone live in September. 1,500 engineers, with a contribution documentation practice committed by their head of engineering in a company-wide announcement that cited the Meridian framework directly. 1,500 more names in the record. She thought about the Hayes Valley coffee shop, the bell ringing on her phone, the 43 minutes she'd given herself. She thought about the yellow legal pad term sheet and the co-working space and the first whiteboard with 3 boxes and the cap table document at 11 p.m. and Tae Yang's chopsticks and Robert Cho's notepad and Jiho's first paper and the London law firm and Leila Amadi and Yuki Tanaka and 41 engineers in an office overlooking the bay. She thought about 131 pages of architecture document, the 4th product direction almost fully specified, the 5th already taking shape in her mind. She turned back to the document. She wrote, Outside San Francisco was doing what it did every October morning, the fog burning off the bay, the light coming in from the east in the specific amber way it came in that month, illuminating the city with the particular quality of light that made it look briefly and exactly like the place that had promised to be worth all the trouble it took to live in. She had found it worth the trouble. She was still finding it worth the trouble. She wrote page 132. She was nowhere near done. That was precisely the point. The work was real. The record was accurate. The names were in the log. She kept building. She had always kept building. That was the whole story. And it was hers. The Series D closed in September of year 4, $120 million at a valuation that Beatrice had described as healthy but not frothy, which was her preferred register for things that were very good. The lead was a new investor, the largest fund that had approached them with a track record in enterprise software that made the partnership credible rather than merely large. The board meeting at which the round was approved ran 3 hours. The final agenda item was a question from Sasha Dreyfus, who remained on the board after 4 years and remained. Nadia thought the clearest thinker in the room about the next product direction. Nadia put up a slide. It had 4 boxes connected by arrows, the original 3 and the 4th she'd drawn on the whiteboard in year 2, and now a 5th in the corner that she hadn't shown anyone yet. The 5th box, she said, is the direction I've been designing for 8 months. Decision intelligence at the network level, not just inside an enterprise, but across supply chain relationships. Between companies. Real-time adaptive documented. She described it for 12 minutes. The board was very quiet. Sasha Dreyfus said, "How long until you have a prototype?" 6 months, Nadia said. "If we staff correctly." Staff correctly how? 4 engineers with specific backgrounds. I have 2 identified, 2 more in process. She paused. And a research collaboration with a group in Singapore I've been building for a year. The Singapore group there in the paper you showed us? The 3rd paper, Nadia said, published in March. 3 of their researchers are on the author list. Dreyfus nodded. Their names are in the record. Always Nadia said. The board approved the 5th product direction. The meeting ended at 4:30. Nadia walked out into the September afternoon, the best month in San Francisco, the month when the city remembered it was capable of warmth and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before calling Claudia. Board approved the 5th direction, she said. I know, Claudia said. You texted me the emoji that means good news. I didn't know that was what that meant. It's definitely what that means. Are we celebrating? We're staffing, Nadia said. Then we're celebrating. The champagne is in the fridge, Claudia said. It's been there for 3 weeks. You bought it 3 weeks ago. I had a feeling about the board meeting. Nadia laughed. The real laugh, the one that came when something was genuinely funny and not just professionally amusing. I'll be in the office in 20 minutes, she said. The 4th research paper, a collaboration between Meridian Dr. Diallo's MIT group and the Singapore team, was submitted in November. 8 authors, 4 institutions, every name in the record. The paper was accepted in January and published in March. Within 60 days, it had been cited by 17 research groups. 2 companies reached out to discuss licensing the methodology. Nadia declined both licenses and suggested instead that they implement the approach using the published paper, which was, after all, the point of publishing it. You could make money from the licenses, Patricia Walsh noted in a conversation about the decision. We make money from building better products, Nadia said. The research belongs to everyone. The implementation belongs to whoever builds it best. Is that in writing anywhere? It's in the culture, Nadia said. Same place everything real lives. Bob. In April, 5 years after the Vantage. IPO Nadia attended the annual AI Enterprise Summit, the conference she had spoken at in year 2, where Marcus had been in the audience and they had spoken briefly in the hallway. She was there as a keynote speaker, this time invited on the basis of the body of work. 4 research papers, the documentation framework and its 41,000 downloads, the fellowship, and a company that had defined a product category. She gave a 40-minute talk. Half of it was technical, the architecture of the 5th product direction, presented in enough detail to be useful and held back enough to be interesting, the balance she had learned over 4 years of conference talks. Half of it was the other thing, the documentation framework, the fellowship numbers, the Hartfield implementation, the London law firm. She ended with the number she always ended with when she had the right audience. 63 names in the record from the fellowship alone. 41,000 framework downloads, 1,500 engineers at Hartfield, unknown numbers from the open source release. She paused. These are the people who were building things. These are the people whose contributions are now documented. The number is going to keep growing. That is the point. She stepped back from the podium. The room came up. Tits. She flew home to San Francisco on a Tuesday evening. She landed at 9 p.m. She took a cab from the airport directly to the office, not home, because she had been thinking on the plane about a specific architectural question on the fifth product direction, and she wanted to look at the code before she slept. She let herself in with her key card. The office was quiet and half-lit, the systems that kept running overnight, the server room that never went dark. She went to her desk. She opened the architecture document. Page 147. She read back the last 3 pages she'd written. They were good. The approach she'd been developing was, she believed, sound, and she had learned over 4 years to trust that belief, while also testing it with the engineers who would build the implementation. The belief was the starting point. The test was what made it real. She wrote 6 pages. The question she'd been thinking about on the plane resolved itself on page 4, which was how it usually worked. You thought about the problem, and then you wrote toward the problem, and somewhere in the writing the solution appeared. Not because writing was magic, but because writing required you to be precise, and precision was where solutions lived. At midnight, she saved the document and closed her laptop. She thought about Hayes Valley briefly. The coffee shop, the bell, the 43 minutes. 4 years later. 41 engineers, 11 customers, 4 research papers, 63 fellows, 41,000 downloads, 147 pages of architecture, a 5th product direction on the whiteboard, and the record. The accurate, maintained, deliberately built record of what had been made and who had made it and when and how. She turned off her desk lamp, she locked the office, she went home. She set her alarm for 5:30. In the morning, she would open the document, page 148. She would write. She had always written. She would always write. Under her own name, with her team's names beside hers in every commit, in every paper, and every decision log. The work was real. The record was accurate. That was the whole story. That was enough. That was everything.